Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The wind in the high Rockies of Colorado spoke a language of solitude. It was a tongue Silver Brook had come to understand better than the words of her own people. For 6 months, the whispering pines and the stoic granite cliffs had been her only counsel. Her exile was a stone in her heart, heavy and cold, but the wilderness that was meant to be her tomb had instead become her domain. She stood on a ledge overlooking a valley carved by ancient ice, a figure of striking contrast against the sprawling canvas of nature. Silver Brook was tall, not just tall for a Ute woman, but tall for any man she had ever seen. Her frame was not gangly or awkward, but powerfully built, with shoulders that could carry a fresh kill for miles, and hands that could snap dry timber with ease. Her long black hair, thick as a horse's tail, was tied back with a strip of leather, revealing a face of strong planes and a jaw set with a quiet determination. Her deerskin tunic and leggings, stitched with her own hand, were worn but durable, practical for a life lived on the edge of survival. This body, this vessel of uncommon size and strength, was the reason for her banishment. The whispers had followed her since she was a girl, growing taller and stronger than all the boys her age. They called her Maya Wapa, the giant woman. It was not a name of respect, but one of fear. When a late frost killed the new spring crops, the shaman, his eyes dark with jealousy of the awe she inspired, declared her a bad omen, a being whose unnatural form angered the spirits and disrupted the balance of the world. The council, swayed by fear and superstition, had cast her out. The pain of that rejection had been a sharp physical blow, but the mountains did not judge her height. The deer did not care for omens when her arrow flew true. The river did not question her right to drink from its cold, clear waters. Here her size was not a curse, it was a gift. It allowed her to climb steeper slopes, to see farther, to intimidate the predators that roamed the timberline. She was alone, but she was alive, and in the harshest corners of the world, that was a victory. Down below, in the rolling foothills where the mountains softened into grasslands, another soul carved out a life against the grain. Lester's world was not one of silent peaks, but of fence posts and the lowing of cattle. His ranch was a modest square of determination etched into the vast landscape, a testament to a spirit far larger than his physical form. Lester was a small man. In a land that valued broad shoulders and a commanding presence, his lack of height had been a constant, unspoken challenge. Men like his neighbor, the hulking cattle baron Grover, looked down on him in every sense of the word. But where others had muscle, Lester had ingenuity. His fences were mended with clever knots and braces that held tighter than any hammered by brute force. He understood the flow of water, digging irrigation ditches that kept his pasture green when others turned brown. His hands, though small, were calloused and capable, and his eyes, a gentle hazel, missed nothing. They saw the subtle shift in a cow's gait that signaled sickness, the distant gathering of clouds that promised rain, and the quiet dignity in creatures that the world deemed insignificant. He had spent a lifetime being underestimated, and it had forged in him a deep well of empathy and a resilience as tough as old leather. His prize cow, a Hereford with a distinctive white face he called Daisy, had a penchant for wandering. That afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, Lester found her tracks leading farther into the broken country than he liked. He followed on his sturdy Morgan horse, weaving through thickets of aspen and over stony creek beds. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer. It was the time of day when the hunters emerged. He found Daisy in a small enclosed meadow, contentedly chewing her cud. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As he dismounted to fasten a lead rope, a scent hit the air, acrid and feral. His horse snorted, its eyes wide with panic. Lester's head snapped up. On a rocky outcrop not 30 yards away, crouched low and ready to spring, was a mountain lion. It was a massive male, its muscles coiled like a powerful spring, its yellow eyes fixed on the most vulnerable target. Him. Lester's heart hammered against his ribs. His rifle was in its scabbard on the saddle, too far to reach without turning his back on the predator. He slowly drew the pistol from his hip, the weight of it a small, inadequate comfort. The cat let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated through the very ground beneath his boots. It was testing him, waiting for a sign of weakness. Daisy bawled in terror, scrambling away and leaving Lester completely exposed. He raised the pistol, his hand surprisingly steady. He was a good shot, but a handgun was a poor choice against a charging cougar. He had one chance, maybe two, before the animal would be on him. The cat took a step forward, its tail twitching, its body tightening for the final lethal leap. Lester braced himself, the world narrowing to the space between him and the beast. And then something impossible happened. From the dense pines at the edge of the meadow, a figure emerged. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied its incredible size. At first, Lester's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. A woman taller than any man he'd ever known stepped into the clearing. She held a long, thick branch in one hand, as if it were a mere walking stick. She didn't shout or scream. She simply appeared. The mountain lion, which had been the undisputed apex predator in this space just a moment before, froze mid-crouch. Its head turned, its ears flattened. The low growl in its throat died. It had faced bears and wolves, but it had never faced anything like this. This being was not prey. Silver Brook's eyes met the cat's. There was no fear in her gaze, only a calm, absolute authority. She took another step forward, her moccasined feet making no sound on the grassy earth. She raised the heavy branch slightly, a silent warning. For a long, tense moment, the three of them were locked in a strange tableau: the tiny man, the giant woman, and the terrified predator. With a choked snarl that sounded more like fear than aggression, the mountain lion broke. It spun around and bolted, disappearing into the rocks and shadows with a speed born of pure instinct. The immediate danger was gone, but the meadow remained charged with an almost electric tension. Lester slowly lowered his pistol, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes were fixed on the woman. She stood bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, her silhouette looking as if it had been carved from the mountain itself. He could see her more clearly now, the proud set of her jaw, the strength in her arms, the deep, soulful loneliness in her dark eyes. He saw the worn leather of her clothes and the weary way she held herself, as if carrying a weight far heavier than the branch in her hand. Fear was not what he felt. He had just been saved by this magnificent, mysterious woman. What he felt was a profound, bone-deep wave of gratitude, and something else, a shock of recognition. He saw in her the same thing he saw in himself every morning in his shaving mirror: an outcast. Someone judged and defined by their body before their heart could even be known. Silver Brook watched him, her expression guarded, her body tense to either fight or flee. She expected the man to scream, to run, or to raise his weapon against her, the monster of the mountains. It was the reaction she had grown accustomed to. Instead, Lester holstered his pistol and took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands held open and away from his body. His voice, when it came, was soft, not much louder than the rustle of the aspen leaves. "Thank you," he said, the words simple and sincere. You saved my life." She did not respond, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, tracked his every move. She understood the words, though his tongue was different from her own. He knew he had to be careful. He gestured toward his horse, then pointed back the way he'd come. "I have a ranch, food, a warm fire." He paused, then made the universal sign of eating, bringing his fingers to his mouth. "You are welcome to share it. It's the least I can do." Silver Brook's composure wavered for a fraction of a second, her brow furrowed in confusion and suspicion. Kindness was a foreign currency in her world of exile. This small man, who should have been terrified of her, was offering her shelter. He wasn't looking at her as a giant, an omen, or a threat. He was looking at her as a person. She took a half-step back, her instincts warring with a deep, aching need for human connection. Lester held his ground, his expression open and patient. He was not a threat. His posture, his voice, his very presence radiated a gentleness that was as disarming as it was strange. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into a deep purple twilight. The cold began to creep in. For the first time in 6 months, Silver Brook faced a choice that wasn't about survival, but about trust. She looked from the small, earnest man to the vast, lonely wilderness that had been her only companion, and for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, she lowered the heavy branch, a silent, tentative acceptance. The journey back to the ranch was a quiet one, wrapped in the deep blue of twilight. Lester led his horse, with Daisy trotting dutifully behind, while Silver Brook walked beside him. She moved with an easy, ground-covering stride that forced him to lengthen his own just to keep pace. The silence between them was not awkward, but filled with a cautious curiosity. For Lester, it was a sense of wonder, as if he were walking alongside a legend come to life. For Silver Brook, it was a state of high alert, her senses drinking in every unfamiliar sound and scent of this tamer world. When they arrived, the ranch was a small island of order in the encroaching wilderness. A sturdy log cabin, with a stone chimney exhaling a gentle curl of smoke, stood as the anchor. A well-built barn, a corral, and neat lines of fencing spoke of tireless effort and a deep pride in one's work. To Silver Brook, who was accustomed to the raw, untamed architecture of nature, this human-made symmetry was both strange and strangely comforting. It was a place built to endure. Lester led the animals to the barn, unsaddling his horse and securing Daisy in a pen with fresh hay and water. He moved with an efficient, practiced rhythm. Silver Brook watched from the doorway, her large frame filling the entrance. She saw the care with which he treated his animals, his gentle words and steady hands. It was a quiet testament to his character. "Come on inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "I'll get a fire going strong. Must be cold for you." Inside, the cabin was simple, clean and warm. A single room served as kitchen, living area and bedroom, with a small loft above. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. It smelled of pine, leather and coffee. Lester motioned for her to sit at the small wooden table, while he added logs to the fire and set a pot of stew to heat. He worked without fuss, occasionally glancing at her. He saw how she took in every detail of the room, her eyes lingering on the stitched quilt on his bed, the small shelf of worn books, the tintype photograph of a stern-looking couple on the mantel. He realized that for all her imposing physical presence, there was a vulnerability about her. She was a ship without a harbor, and he had just offered her a temporary mooring. The stew was thick with potatoes and venison, and he served it with a chunk of coarse bread. Silver Brook ate with a slow, deliberate pace, as if savoring not just the food, but the simple act of sharing a meal at a table under a roof. They didn't speak much. Words were a barrier they had yet to breach. Instead, they communicated through gestures. He'd point to the salt, and she would nod. She'd finish her water, and he would refill her cup without being asked. In these small, shared moments, the first threads of trust were being spun. The next morning, the reality of their partnership began to take shape. Lester was used to working from sunup to sundown, his days a long battle against the endless tasks a ranch demanded. That morning, he found a section of the corral fence had been smashed, likely by a spooked bull. A heavy corner post, thick as a tree trunk, had snapped at its base. It was a full day's work for him, involving levers, ropes, and a great deal of cursing. He was struggling to pry the broken stump from the ground when Silver Brook appeared at his side. She watched him for a moment, his face red with exertion, the muscles in his back straining against the unyielding wood. Then, without a word, she knelt. She wrapped her powerful hands around the base of the stump, found her footing, and stood. The wood groaned in protest, roots snapping deep in the earth, and then it was free. She tossed it aside as if it were a piece of kindling. Lester stared, his crowbar hanging uselessly in his hands. He looked from the discarded stump to her, a slow grin spreading across his face. It was a grin of pure, unadulterated admiration. She returned a small, shy smile, the first he had seen. From that moment on, they became a team. Her raw strength and his practical knowledge created a synergy that transformed the ranch. Fences were mended in half the time. Boulders that had blocked his plowing for years were moved. When a heavy beam in the barn needed replacing, she lifted it into place while he secured it. In return, he taught her the rhythm of the ranch. He showed her how to milk Daisy, how to mend a leather harness, and the best places to forage for wild onions near the creek. He learned a few words of her Ute dialect. She began to pick up his English. Water, fence, good. Their vocabulary was small, but their understanding was growing with each passing day. They discovered they were more alike than different. Both were accustomed to solitude. Both knew the sting of being judged on sight. Both found solace in hard work and the quiet company of the land. The respect between them was a palpable thing, a sturdy bridge being built across the chasm of their different worlds. It was this newfound prosperity, this quiet hum of a well-run ranch, that brought trouble riding to their doorstep. Grover arrived one afternoon, his massive frame perched atop a horse that seemed too small for him. He was flanked by two hired hands, who wore their guns with an air of casual menace. Grover was a man who took up space, physically and metaphorically. His voice was a booming baritone that he used to crush dissent and belittle those he considered his inferiors, which, in his view, was nearly everyone. "Lester," he bellowed, reining his horse to a halt and spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Lester's boots. "Heard you were getting your fences fixed." Figured you must have hired a whole crew. His eyes scanned the tidy ranch with a contemptuous sneer. He had been trying to buy Lester out for years, coveting the reliable creek that ran through the property. Just keeping busy, Grover, Lester replied, his voice calm and even. He stood his ground, not letting the bigger man's presence intimidate him. Grover's gaze then fell on Silver Brook, who had just emerged from the barn carrying a full trough of water with an ease that should have been impossible. His jaw went slack. His sneer vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into cruel amusement. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, a nasty smile spreading across his face. "So that's your crew. Where in God's name did you find that? Some traveling circus?" Lester's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's my partner," he said, his voice dangerously low, "and you'll show her some respect." Grover threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed across the yard. "Partner? You got yourself a pet giantess, Lester. Does she do tricks? Does she fetch?" His men snickered along with him. Silver Brook stood perfectly still, the water trough held steady in her grip. Her face was an impassive mask, but Lester could see the flicker of old pain in her eyes. It was the same look of humiliation she must have endured 1,000 times before. A hot, protective anger surged through him, so fierce it nearly choked him. He took a step forward, placing himself between Grover and Silver Brook. "Get off my land, Grover," he said, his voice ringing with an authority Grover had never heard from him before. Grover's amusement faded, replaced by irritation. "Don't get brave, little man. This changes nothing. This land is wasted on you. I'm still gonna have it. Maybe your friend can lift the house for you when you move." He gave Silver Brook one last, lingering look of derision, then wheeled his horse around. "Think on my offer, Lester. It won't get any better." They watched until Grover and his men were distant specks on the horizon. The yard felt sullied by their presence. The air was thick with the poison of Grover's words. Lester turned to Silver Brook. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she stared at the ground, refusing to meet his eyes. The wall she had built around herself was back, thicker than ever. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "Don't you listen to him," he said softly. "He's a man whose heart is smaller than a mustard seed. His words mean nothing." She finally looked up, her dark eyes searching his. She expected to see pity, or perhaps a hint of the same disgust Grover had shown. Instead, she saw only a fierce, unwavering loyalty. She saw a man who was not ashamed to stand with her, but proud. A man who had stood up for her, despite his size, against a man twice as big. In that moment, the last of her suspicion washed away. He was not just a kind man, he was a courageous one. He saw her, not the giant, not the freak, not the omen. He saw Silver Brook. A quiet understanding passed between them, more powerful than any spoken word. The threat from the outside world had not broken them. It had forged their alliance into something stronger, something that was beginning to feel a lot like home. The weeks that followed Grover's visit settled into a new kind of normal. The blatant threat had solidified the bond between Lester and Silver Brook, transforming their cautious alliance into a seamless partnership. They worked as one, a silent ballet of his planning and her power. Yet a shadow lingered. They both knew Grover was not a man to make idle threats. His greed was a patient predator, and they were living in its hunting grounds. The attack, when it came, was not a direct assault. It was something more insidious, aimed at the very lifeblood of the ranch. Lester rose one morning to find the water in his irrigation ditch, the one that kept his pastures alive, had slowed to a muddy trickle. His heart sank. Without that creek, his land would wither, his cattle would thirst, and his ranch would die. He and Silver Brook followed the ditch upstream, their boots sinking into the soft earth. They found the source of the problem a quarter-mile from the cabin. A massive rock slide, too precise, too deliberate to be natural, had been created, damming the narrowest point of the creek. Heavy logs had been wedged among the boulders to create a nearly impenetrable wall, diverting the water's flow away from Lester's property and toward the arid lands bordering Grover's vast territory. It was a clear and brutal message. Lester's face was grim. "This is Grover's work. He's trying to choke us out." Silver Brook surveyed the blockage. Her eyes, accustomed to reading the land, saw the fresh scrapes on the rocks and the deep gouges where logs had been levered into place. It was the work of several men, crude but effective. For a man of Lester's size, clearing it would take weeks. For her, it was simply a challenge. She waded into the cold, knee-deep water, the force of the current pushing against her. She braced her feet, gripped the end of a key log, and heaved. Her muscles strained, the tendons in her neck standing out like cords of rope. The log, slick with water and weighing hundreds of pounds, refused to budge. It was wedged too tightly. Lester, seeing her struggle, immediately began working with his shovel, digging away at the packed earth and smaller rocks around the log's base, trying to relieve the pressure. They worked for hours under the morning sun, a symphony of grunts, scraping shovels, and the groaning of stressed wood. Finally, with one last monumental effort from Silver Brook, the key log shifted. With a great sucking sound, it tore free. The dam broke. Water surged through the gap, a muddy, triumphant torrent reclaiming its rightful path. They stood panting on the bank, soaked and covered in mud, watching the water flow freely once more. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. It was then that they realized they were not alone. Standing at the edge of the tree line, as silent and still as the aspens around him, was a man. He was Ute, dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, his face lean and weathered, his long black hair braided with a single hawk feather. He held a bow in one hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. His eyes were fixed on Silver Brook. Lester's first instinct was protective. He moved immediately, placing his smaller frame between the newcomer and Silver Brook, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The man's gaze flickered to Lester, assessing him for a brief moment before returning to Silver Brook. He did not raise his weapon. He spoke a single word in the Ute tongue, a name uttered with a mix of reverence and sorrow. "Maya Wapa." Silver Brook's body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this man. She stepped out from behind Lester, her eyes wide with a storm of conflicting emotions. "Wicasa," she said, her own voice raspy from disuse. Wicasa took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He was not a threat. His posture spoke of a heavy heart. He had been a warrior in her tribe, a man who had often looked at her not with fear, but with an unspoken admiration that he had never dared to voice. "I did not agree with the council," Wicasa said in his language, knowing she would understand. "My heart was sick when they sent you away." "Why are you here?" she asked, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "Have they sent you to finish the shaman's work, to ensure the omen is truly gone?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I have come to warn you, to tell you the truth." He switched to broken, heavily accented English for Lester's benefit. "The reason for your exile? It was a lie." Silver Brook stared at him, her impassive mask crumbling into confusion. Lester watched her, seeing the deep, ancient wound of her rejection being touched. Wicasa continued, his voice low and urgent. "A shaman, Nakai. He was jealous. Your strength, the young warriors spoke of it with respect. The women saw you as a protector. You are becoming a leader without a title. He feared your influence. The late frost was his excuse. He wove a tale of bad spirits, of imbalance. He poisoned the chief's mind against you. There was no omen, Silver Brook, only the fear of a small man." The world seemed to tilt under Silver Brook's feet. For 6 long months she had carried the belief that she was a curse, that her very being was a flaw in the fabric of the world. To hear that it was all built on the petty jealousy of one man was like having the ground ripped out from under her. It was not a relief. It was a new kind of agony. It meant her people had not been swayed by spirits, but by a simple, venomous lie. But Wicasa was not finished. "His poison has spread beyond our tribe," he said, his eyes darkening. He looked from Silver Brook to Lester, connecting the two disparate pieces of their lives. "Nikkei, I have seen him. He meets with the big rancher, the one they call Grover." Lester's head snapped up. "Grover? What business would a Ute shaman have with him?" "Grover wants to move his cattle through the high passes on the southern edge of our lands, a shortcut to the railroad," Wicasa explained. "The council has forbidden it, but Nikkei has made his own deal. He promised Grover's men safe passage, to look the other way, in exchange for rifles and whiskey." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Grover's renewed aggression, his sabotage, the shaman's betrayal, it was all one story. Lester's ranch was likely a strategic inconvenience, a small holdout in the path of Grover's illicit trail. Getting rid of Lester was part of the deal. The exile of Silver Brook and the threat to this small patch of land were intertwined, born from the same dark well of greed and corruption. "He is a traitor to our people," Wicasa said, his voice filled with contempt. He sells our honor for firewater and guns. That is why I am here." He looked directly at Silver Brook, his gaze intense. "You must come back. Your name is still spoken, though in whispers. If you return, if you tell them what you know, they will believe you. Your strength is not a curse, it is a symbol. Help me expose Nekai. Take back your place among us. You are Ute. This is not your home." His final words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "This is not your home." Silver Brook felt as if she were being torn in two. One hand was being pulled back toward the life that had been stolen from her, toward the justice she deserved and the people she still loved, despite their betrayal. Wikasa offered her a path to reclaim her identity, to shed the skin of the outcast and stand tall as a hero among her kin, but her other hand was firmly anchored here, in this small, quiet valley. Her gaze drifted to Lester, who had stood by her side, his expression a mixture of anger at the injustice and deep concern for her. He had not abandoned her. He had not feared her. He had looked at a giant and seen a partner. He had given her something she thought she had lost forever, a place to belong. The simple cabin, the lowing of the cattle, the shared meals at the small wooden table, that was home. She was caught between two worlds, between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The pain of the choice was etched on her face, a silent, agonizing conflict. Lester saw it all. He saw the pull of her past and the hope for her future warring in her eyes. He stepped forward, his voice gentle but clear. "This is your decision, Silver Brook," he said, meeting her tormented gaze. "Not his, and not mine. Whatever you choose to do, I'll stand by you. If you need to go, I'll understand. If you choose to stay and fight here, I'll be right beside you." He offered her not a command, not a plea, but a gift more valuable than any other. He offered her freedom. The choice was hers, and as the creek flowed past them, carrying away the debris of Grover's hatred, Silver Brook was left with the wreckage of her own heart, unsure which pieces to pick up. The weight of Wikasa's offer pressed down on Silver Brook, heavier than any boulder she had ever lifted. The path back to her people was a path to vindication, a chance to rewrite the story of her exile. Yet as she looked at the modest cabin, at the scarred knuckles of the small man who had offered her his home without question, she felt an undeniable truth settle in her soul. A home was not the land you were born on. It was the ground where you chose to plant your heart. And her heart had taken root here, in this small, quiet patch of earth beside a man whose courage dwarfed his stature. She was about to speak, to tell Wikasa that her choice was made, when a new sound reached them. It was a low, distant rumble, like far-away thunder, but the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. It was not the sound of a storm, but of the earth itself trembling in fear. Wikasa's head shot up, his warrior's instincts instantly on alert. Lester's eyes widened, his gaze sweeping the low hills that marked the edge of his property. "Stampede," he breathed, the single word sharp with dread. The rumble grew into a deafening roar. Over the nearest rise, a terrifying wave of brown and white crested, hundreds of cattle, their eyes wild with terror, their horns a thicket of sharpened points, charging directly for the ranch. Behind them, spread out in a line, were riders, firing pistols into the air, driving the herd forward. At their head, on his big bay horse, was Grover, and beside him a figure in Ute clothing whose face was contorted in a mask of malicious triumph, the shaman, Nekai. There was no time for deliberation, no time for anything but action. This was Grover's final, desperate play, an act of brute force designed to wipe the ranch and everyone in it from the face of the earth. "They're aiming for the cabin!" Lester yelled over the din. "We can't outrun them." His mind, always his sharpest weapon, was racing. He scanned the terrain, his eyes darting from the oncoming herd to the layout of his land. He saw it, a desperate, razor-thin chance. A narrow gully, carved by spring floods, ran parallel to the cabin before snaking away into the hills. It was deep enough to be a trap. "The gully," he shouted, pointing. "If I can turn the leaders, I can funnel them in. Wikasa, I need you to keep Grover's men from pushing the flanks. Don't let them steer the herd away." Wikasa nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. He was no longer just a messenger. This was now a battle for the honor of his people as much as for the survival of the ranch. He drew an arrow from his quiver, his movements fluid and deadly. Lester turned to Silver Brook, his eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in them, only a complete and total trust. "Silver Brook," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The gully ends near that stand of old cottonwoods. There's a deadfall there, a huge log. I need a wall. I need you to be the wall." She didn't need to be told twice. While Wicasa sprinted for a high point of rock that gave him a clear line of fire, and Lester leaped onto his horse's back, kicking it into a full gallop, Silver Brook ran. She moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her size, her powerful legs eating up the ground. She was not running from the danger, but toward the heart of the solution. Lester rode like a man possessed, a tiny figure charging toward a tidal wave of flesh and bone. He angled his horse not at the center of the herd, but at its head, firing his pistol into the ground just in front of the lead steer. The animal, already crazed with fear, shied away from the sound and flash, turning its momentum just enough. It was a terrifyingly delicate dance, a nudge of a few degrees that, over the distance, would make all the difference. From his perch, Wicasa's bow sang. His arrows flew with silent precision. One of Grover's riders yelped as an arrow pinned his sleeve to his saddle. Another's hat was plucked from his head. Wicasa was not killing them, but sowing chaos and confusion, breaking their control over the stampede and forcing them to focus on the unseen threat in the rocks. Grover roared in frustration as he saw the head of the herd begin to veer toward the gully. "Push them back, turn them," he bellowed, but his men were scattered, unnerved by the phantom archer. The lead cattle plunged into the gully, the rest of the herd following blindly, their own momentum sealing their fate. The narrow channel was now a churning river of panicked animals. Silver Brook reached the cottonwoods just as the first steers appeared at the far end of the gully. The deadfall Lester had mentioned was there. A monstrous log, thick as a man, was tall, half rotten but immensely heavy. It would take 10 men to move it. She had only her own 2 hands. She braced her feet, sinking her moccasins into the soft earth. She bent her back, wrapping her arms around the rough bark. A great primal cry tore from her throat as she lifted, a sound of pure, unadulterated effort. The log groaned, resisting, its weight a dead, crushing thing. Dirt and rotten wood showered down on her. Her muscles screamed, fire coursing through her veins. For a heartbeat it seemed impossible. Then, drawing on every ounce of pain from her exile, on every bit of kindness Lester had shown her, she found a new well of strength. With a final explosive heave, she swung the log into place, blocking the end of the gully. The first steer crashed into the barrier, its momentum stopped cold. The animal behind it piled into it, and the one behind that. The stampede collapsed in on itself, a chaotic, bellowing mess. The charge was broken. The ranch was saved. Grover, seeing his plan in ruins, let out a yell of pure fury. He spurred his horse out of the chaos, his face purple with rage, and charged directly at Lester. "You insignificant little pest," he screamed, raising his rifle to use as a club, but he never reached him. Wicasa, his duty done, had descended from the rocks. He stepped into Grover's path, his bow held ready. And beside him, covered in sweat and dirt, but standing tall and indomitable, was Silver Brook. Grover reined in his horse, his eyes darting between the immovable woman and the deadly warrior. His 2 remaining men, seeing the tables had turned, had already begun to retreat. The fight was over. Grover was beaten. At that moment, Wicasa's gaze shifted past Grover to the shaman, Nikai, who was trying to slip away unnoticed. "Traitor!" Wicasa's voice rang with the authority of his ancestors. "You have sold your people for the white man's trinkets. You have no honor." Nikai froze, his face ashen. Grover looked from the shaman to Wicasa, the full scope of the betrayal now laid bare for all to see. With a final, venomous curse, Grover spun his horse and fled, a disgraced coward leaving his co-conspirator to his fate. Wicasa strode forward and seized Nikai by the arm. "You will face the judgment of the council," he said, his voice cold as stone. He turned to Silver Brook, his eyes filled with a new, profound respect. "You saved us today, sister. You showed us that true strength comes from the heart, not just the arm. Your place is here." He nodded once to Lester, a gesture of thanks between 2 men who had fought for the same cause. Then he led the shamed shaman away, back toward the mountains to face justice. The dust began to settle. The lowing of the confused cattle filled the sudden quiet. The ranch was a mess of hoofprints and debris, but it was still standing. Lester slid off his horse, his legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He walked over to Silver Brook, who was leaning against the log she had moved, her breathing heavy. He stopped in front of her, having to crane his neck to look up at her face. He saw the exhaustion, the pain, and the overwhelming relief in her eyes. He saw the woman who had been cast out, the woman who had saved him, the woman who had become his entire world. A slow smile touched his lips. "Some wall," he said softly. She looked down at him. a genuine, radiant smile transforming her face. For the first time she reached out, not to lift or to fight, but to touch. Her large, powerful hand gently cupped his cheek. He leaned into her touch, a perfect fit. In that moment, the world saw a giant woman and a tiny cowboy. But all they saw was each other. The outcasts had found their home not on a map, but in the shelter of each other's hearts. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they were whole. A person's true measure is not found in their physical stature, but in the size of their heart, the depth of their courage and their capacity for kindness. True belonging is found not where you are born, but where you are seen and accepted for who you truly are. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.